What would you do if you walked into your own home, and someone told you that you didn't live there anymore? Not joking. Not arguing. Just stating it like it was a fact. Now imagine that someone wasn't a stranger. It was your husband. And the woman sitting comfortably on your couch was his mistress. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's exactly what happened to Eleanor Whitmore. She was 62 years old, retired, and had been married for 28 years. Nearly 3 decades of shared holidays, mortgage payments, quiet dinners, and ordinary mornings. The kind of marriage that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. The kind people assume will simply last forever. But on one Tuesday afternoon, everything about that life cracked open in a way Eleanor never expected. And the strange part? The real story didn't begin when she found the other woman. It began with one folded piece of paper in her handbag. But we'll come back to that. First, you need to understand how Eleanor ended up walking into the most surreal moment of her life. That day wasn't supposed to be unusual. Eleanor had spent the morning visiting an old friend across town. They'd talked over coffee longer than expected, reminiscing about retirement plans, travel dreams, and the strange quiet that comes after decades of working. Normally she wouldn't get home until late afternoon. But that day she left early. No particular reason. Just one of those small, random decisions people make without thinking. The kind of tiny change in routine that seems meaningless at the time. Except sometimes those small decisions expose things that were carefully hidden. When Eleanor pulled into her driveway around 2 o'clock, she noticed something odd immediately. A silver sedan she didn't recognize was parked in front of the house. Now, Richard occasionally had friends over. Golf buddies, former coworkers, people from the neighborhood. So at first Eleanor didn't think much of it. But as she walked toward the front door, something else caught her attention. High heels. Black, glossy, unfamiliar high heels sitting neatly on the entryway mat. Eleanor stood there for a moment, staring at them. They definitely weren't hers. And they definitely didn't belong to any of the women she knew who visited the house. Then she heard laughter. It came from the living room. A woman's voice. Light, relaxed, completely comfortable. Followed by Richard's voice. That's when Eleanor felt the first tight knot form in her stomach. Still, she didn't rush in. She didn't slam the door or shout. Eleanor Whitmore had always been the type of woman who processed things quietly before reacting. So she stepped inside slowly. And what she saw stopped her cold. There was a young woman sitting on Eleanor's cream-colored sofa like she had lived there for years. Her legs were crossed casually. One of Eleanor's decorative pillows was tucked behind her back. A glass of wine sat on the coffee table. And standing beside her, looking strangely calm, was Richard Whitmore. Her husband. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Richard broke the silence. He cleared his throat and gestured toward the woman. Eleanor, this is Vanessa. The woman gave a small wave. Vanessa Cole. 34 years old. Confident. Stylish. The kind of woman who seemed completely at ease in someone else's space. But Richard didn't stop there. He said something Eleanor would replay in her mind 1,000 times afterward. She lives here now. Just like that. No explanation. No apology. No hesitation. Eleanor simply stood there, staring at them. At first she thought it had to be some bizarre misunderstanding. Maybe a terrible joke that hadn't landed properly. But then Vanessa laughed. Not nervously. Not awkwardly. She laughed like the whole situation was amusing. Richard laughed too. And that was the moment Eleanor realized something was very, very wrong. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, studying Eleanor the way someone might examine an unexpected guest. You should probably leave, she said casually. Richard told me the house situation was already handled. Handled? The word hung in the air like a puzzle piece that didn't belong anywhere. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply stood there. And that seemed to irritate Vanessa. The younger woman pulled out her phone and sighed dramatically. Okay, this is getting ridiculous. She started dialing. Richard watched without saying a word. Then Vanessa spoke into the phone. Hi, yes. I need an officer here. There's a woman trespassing in my boyfriend's house. Trespassing. In her own house. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into the driveway. Officer Daniel Ruiz, 41 years old, calm and observant, stepped inside the front door and immediately sensed the tension in the room. Before Eleanor could even say a word, Richard pointed directly at her. That's her, he said. She doesn't belong here anymore. Imagine hearing that from someone you'd shared nearly 3 decades with. Officer Ruiz turned to Eleanor. Ma'am, he asked carefully, do you live here? Eleanor didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she quietly reached into her handbag. Inside was a folded document. A piece of paper she had kept for years, just in case. She handed it to the officer. Officer Ruiz unfolded the paper and began reading. At first his expression was neutral. Then his eyebrows lifted. His eyes widened slightly. He read the document again. And then he slowly turned toward Richard Whitmore. But the question he asked next wasn't directed at him. It was directed at Eleanor. Does she know about this? Eleanor glanced briefly at Vanessa. Then she shook her head. Not yet. But what that paper said was about to change everything. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly realized something was completely wrong? Not just awkward. Not just uncomfortable. Wrong in a way that makes your brain pause for a second because it can't quite process what's happening. That was the atmosphere in Eleanor Whitmore's living room the moment Officer Daniel Ruiz finished reading the folded document. But here's the strange thing. While everyone else in that room was tense, irritated, or defensive, Eleanor was calm. Too calm. And that calmness began to bother Vanessa Cole. Vanessa shifted on the couch and crossed her arms, her earlier confidence starting to crack just slightly. Well, she said impatiently. What does it say? Officer Ruiz didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the room carefully, like he was piecing together a puzzle that only he could see. Richard cleared his throat and tried to sound authoritative. Officer, this is pretty simple, he said. My wife and I are separated. She doesn't live here anymore. Eleanor slowly turned her head and looked at him. Separated? That was news to her. But again, she didn't argue. And that silence seemed to confuse everyone even more. Now think about this for a moment. If someone falsely accused you of trespassing in your own home, how would you react? Most people would shout. Some might cry. Others might start throwing accusations. But Eleanor did something completely different. She walked over to the armchair across from the sofa and sat down. Calmly. Like a guest watching someone else's argument unfold. Vanessa let out a small laugh. Oh wow. She really thinks she can just sit down. Richard looked uncomfortable now. Not angry. Uncomfortable. Because something about Eleanor's behavior wasn't fitting the script he expected. Officer Ruiz finally spoke. Let me make sure I understand the situation. He turned to Richard. You're saying you own this property? Richard nodded quickly. Yes. And you want this woman removed? Yes. Officer Ruiz then turned toward Eleanor. And you're saying you live here? Eleanor nodded once. Yes. Simple answers. No drama. No emotion. But here's where things started getting interesting. Because Vanessa suddenly jumped into the conversation again, eager to push things forward. She doesn't live here, Vanessa said firmly. Richard told me everything was finalized months ago. Finalized. Another strange word. Officer Ruiz raised an eyebrow. Finalized, he repeated. Vanessa nodded confidently. Yes. The house transfer. The divorce paperwork. All of it. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. That was the first real reaction she'd shown. And it was subtle. But it was enough for the officer to notice. Sir, Officer Ruiz said, turning back to Richard. Do you have any documents showing ownership? For the first time since the officer arrived, Richard hesitated. Just for a second. But sometimes 1 second is enough to expose everything. Well, not here, Richard said. Vanessa looked at him immediately. What do you mean not here? She asked. It's probably in my office, Richard replied quickly. Probably. Another word that didn't sound very confident. Officer Ruiz slowly held up the paper Eleanor had given him. Because according to this document, the ownership situation appears to be very clear. Vanessa leaned forward. Then read it, she said. So we can finish this. But instead of reading it aloud, the officer asked a question. One simple question. Ma'am, he said to Eleanor, how long have you owned this house? Eleanor answered without hesitation. 22 years. Richard scoffed. Well, yeah, we bought it together. But the officer shook his head. That's not what this document says. The room went quiet. Vanessa looked confused now. What do you mean? She asked. Officer Ruiz glanced down at the paper again. Then he said something that immediately shifted the entire atmosphere. The legal owner of this property is listed as Eleanor Whitmore. Vanessa blinked. Once. Twice. Then she looked at Richard. Okay, but that's just paperwork, right? She said. You're married. Richard opened his mouth. But no words came out. Because Officer Ruiz wasn't finished. There is no co-owner listed, he continued. Vanessa's voice sharpened. What? The officer turned the paper slightly so she could see it. Richard Whitmore's name does not appear anywhere on the deed. And just like that, the confidence drained from the room. Vanessa stared at Richard. You told me this house was yours. Richard's face was turning pale now. That's not, technically. But the officer lifted a finger. There's also another detail here. A very important detail. He tapped a specific line on the document. And whatever he was reading made him pause. Officer Ruiz looked back at Eleanor. You added this clause 12 years ago? Eleanor nodded calmly. Yes. Vanessa frowned. What clause? The officer looked at her again. Then he asked Eleanor the same question he had asked earlier. Does she know about this? Eleanor's answer was the same. Not yet. Vanessa stood up now, irritation turning into anger. Know about what? But the truth was. The sentence written in that clause was about to destroy everything Richard had tried to build. And once Vanessa heard it, there would be no going back. What could possibly be written on one piece of paper that makes a police officer look at a husband like he's suddenly the one in trouble? That's the question hanging in Eleanor Whitmore's living room. Vanessa Cole was standing now, arms stiff at her sides, staring at the document Officer Ruiz was holding like it contained some kind of secret code. And in a way, it did. But the most interesting part wasn't just what the paper said. It was how long Eleanor had been carrying it. Think about that for a second. Years. This wasn't something she printed that morning. This wasn't a last-minute defense. This document had been quietly sitting in her handbag for a very long time. Waiting for a moment she hoped would never come. Vanessa finally lost patience. Okay, seriously, she snapped. What clause are we talking about? Officer Ruiz glanced at Eleanor again, almost asking permission with his eyes. Eleanor gave a small nod. The officer cleared his throat. This property deed was updated 12 years ago, he began. Richard shifted his weight uncomfortably. That doesn't mean anything, he said quickly. People update deeds all the time. Correct, the officer said calmly. Then he continued reading. But the updated filing establishes Eleanor Whitmore as the sole legal owner of the property. Vanessa looked confused. But they're married, she said. Yes, the officer replied. But marriage does not automatically guarantee joint ownership of property. Now here's something a lot of people don't realize. In many situations, a home can legally belong to only one spouse. Especially if it was purchased with personal funds or legally restructured later. And that's exactly where this story begins to turn. Because 12 years earlier, Eleanor made a decision that Richard barely noticed. Let's rewind for a moment. 12 years before this strange afternoon, Eleanor's mother passed away. It wasn't sudden, but it was difficult. Along with memories and family heirlooms, Eleanor inherited a modest but meaningful sum of money. Instead of spending it, she did something practical. She paid off the remaining mortgage on the house. Completely. No more bank payments. No more interest. The house was finally free. Now you might think that would be a moment a couple celebrates together. But Richard barely paid attention. He was traveling frequently for work back then. Busy. Distracted. Focused on other things. He signed the paperwork Eleanor placed in front of him without reading much. And that's when Eleanor visited someone important. Attorney Margaret Ellis. 58 years old. Meticulous. Patient. The kind of lawyer who believed in planning for situations most people preferred not to think about. During that meeting, Eleanor asked a simple question. What happens if something ever goes wrong in my marriage? Margaret didn't rush to answer. Instead, she asked Eleanor something back. How protected do you want to be? That conversation led to a quiet legal adjustment. One Richard never asked about. Back in the present, Officer Ruiz looked up from the deed. This clause states that the property cannot be transferred, leveraged, or claimed by another party without Eleanor Whitmore's direct authorization. Vanessa frowned. Okay, but Richard lives here, she said. Yes, the officer replied. Living somewhere does not equal ownership. Vanessa turned to Richard again, her voice tightening. You told me you owned the house. Richard rubbed the back of his neck. It's complicated. But Officer Ruiz wasn't finished. There is an additional section. Now the tension in the room thickened again. Even Eleanor leaned forward slightly. The officer read slowly. In the event that another individual falsely claims ownership of the property, attempts unauthorized transfer, or misrepresents legal authority regarding the residence, the sole owner retains immediate eviction rights and may initiate fraud review. The word fraud seemed to echo in the room. Vanessa's eyes widened. She turned sharply toward Richard. What does that mean? Richard's mouth opened, then closed again. Officer Ruiz answered calmly. It means if someone knowingly claims ownership they do not legally possess, that could become a legal matter. Suddenly the situation had flipped. Completely. 10 minutes ago, Vanessa believed Eleanor was about to be escorted out of the house. Now she was staring at Richard like she'd just discovered a stranger. But the biggest twist hadn't even happened yet. Because as the officer lowered the paper, he noticed another line beneath the clause. A line that made him pause earlier. He looked back at Eleanor carefully. Ma'am, he said, are you saying your husband was unaware of the secondary condition attached to this clause? Eleanor's voice was steady. Yes. Vanessa immediately stepped closer. What secondary condition? The officer tapped the paper again. According to this document, if someone attempts to claim the property through misrepresentation, the owner can exercise immediate residential removal rights. Vanessa blinked. What does that mean in normal language? The officer answered. It means Eleanor Whitmore can legally ask anyone in this house to leave. Vanessa looked confused. Anyone? The officer nodded once. Yes. And then he added one more sentence. Including her husband. The room went silent. Vanessa slowly turned toward Richard. And the look on her face had completely changed. Because the man who promised her a house didn't actually own one. But the real shock? Eleanor still hadn't revealed the final piece of the puzzle. And when she did, Richard's entire plan would collapse in a way he never expected. There's a moment in every lie when the person telling it realizes the story has fallen apart. You can actually see it happen. The confidence disappears first. Then the excuses begin. And finally, the silence. That moment had just arrived for Richard Whitmore. A few minutes earlier, he had been standing proudly in his own living room, pointing at Eleanor like she was the intruder. Now he stood frozen beside the couch while Officer Ruiz calmly held the deed in his hands. And Vanessa Cole, the woman who had laughed at Eleanor only minutes ago, was staring at Richard like she was seeing him for the first time. So wait, Vanessa said slowly. You don't own this house? Richard tried to recover. It's not that simple. That's usually the first sentence people say when something is exactly that simple. Vanessa's voice sharpened. You told me the house was yours. I live here, Richard insisted. But Officer Ruiz spoke again. Sir, living somewhere does not establish ownership. Short sentence. Very clear. And suddenly the entire foundation of Richard's story started collapsing. Vanessa turned fully toward him now. So the divorce paperwork you told me about. Richard looked trapped. That's still being worked on. Vanessa let out a short laugh. But this time it wasn't confident. It was the kind of laugh people make when they realize they've been fooled. Meanwhile, Eleanor had not moved from the armchair. She watched quietly. And that quietness was beginning to make everyone uneasy. Officer Ruiz turned back to her. Ma'am, he said carefully, based on this document, you have the legal authority to determine who is allowed to remain on the property. Eleanor nodded slightly. Yes. Vanessa crossed her arms. Well, that's ridiculous, she said. Richard lives here. You can't just throw your husband out. Eleanor tilted her head. And for the first time since she walked through the door, she smiled. Not a big smile. Just a small one. Actually, she said, it's not that difficult. Vanessa frowned. What does that mean? Before Eleanor answered, the officer spoke again. There's one more detail here that we haven't addressed. He looked down at the deed. Then back up. This clause includes a secondary legal trigger. Richard stiffened immediately. What trigger? The officer spoke slowly, making sure everyone understood. If the spouse of the property owner attempts to falsely represent ownership, initiate unauthorized transfer, or present the residence as their personal property to a third party, the owner may exercise immediate removal rights. Vanessa blinked. Third party? The officer gestured gently toward her. That would include you. Now the puzzle pieces were starting to connect in Vanessa's mind. Her eyes widened slightly. You told me the house was yours, she repeated to Richard. Richard ran a hand across his forehead. I thought it basically was. But it isn't, she snapped. No, the officer confirmed calmly. It is not. And that's when Eleanor finally stood up. Slowly. The room became quiet again. She looked at Richard. Not with anger. Not even with sadness. Just calm clarity. Richard, she said, how long have you been planning this? He blinked. What? You told her the house situation was handled, Eleanor continued. So I assume you had a plan. Richard said nothing. That silence said everything. Vanessa stepped back from him. You said we were moving in here together, she said. Richard tried to explain. I thought once the refinance went through. The officer interrupted. You attempted to refinance the property? Richard froze again. Wrong answer. Officer Ruiz continued. If you attempted to refinance a property you do not legally own, that could raise serious issues with the lender. Vanessa looked stunned. You tried to refinance a house that isn't yours? Richard's voice dropped. I thought it would work out. But Eleanor spoke again. That was the interesting part. Everyone looked at her. Because when the bank contacted me 6 months ago, I realized something. Vanessa's head turned sharply. The bank contacted you? Eleanor nodded. Yes. Now the room had a new layer of tension. Because suddenly it was clear. Eleanor had known something was happening long before today. Officer Ruiz looked curious now. 6 months ago? Yes, Eleanor said. And that's when I spoke with my attorney again. Richard's eyes widened. What did you do? Eleanor reached into her handbag once more. Inside was another document. Not the deed. Something else. Something Richard had already signed. Without realizing what it meant. She placed the second folded paper on the coffee table. And said quietly. I made sure everything was properly documented. Vanessa looked between them. What is that? Eleanor looked directly at Richard. And answered. It's the agreement you signed during tax season. Richard's face drained of color. Because suddenly he remembered. But what that agreement actually contained was about to destroy the last piece of leverage he thought he had. There is something fascinating about the moment a person realizes they've walked directly into a trap they didn't even know existed. Not a dramatic trap. Not revenge. Just careful preparation. And that was exactly what was sitting on Eleanor Whitmore's coffee table. A single folded document. Richard Whitmore stared at it like it might explode. Because now he remembered it. Tax season. 3 months earlier. A stack of papers Eleanor had asked him to sign while they were reviewing financial documents. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Just routine paperwork. At least that's what he thought. Vanessa pointed at the paper. What is that? Eleanor answered calmly. A postnuptial agreement. The room went completely silent. Now here's something interesting most people don't think about. Everyone knows what a prenuptial agreement is. But far fewer people understand postnuptial agreements. They're signed after a marriage has already begun, and they legally define how assets, property, and responsibilities are handled going forward. And Richard had signed one. Without reading it. Officer Ruiz glanced at the document as Eleanor unfolded it. Is this legally filed? He asked. Yes, Eleanor said. 3 months ago. Richard shook his head immediately. No, that's not what that was. Eleanor slid the paper across the table toward the officer. It is exactly what it was. Officer Ruiz read through the first page carefully. Then the second. His expression changed again, not shocked this time, but impressed. Vanessa watched nervously. Well, she asked. The officer looked up. This document confirms that the house, including all equity and land rights, belongs exclusively to Eleanor Whitmore. Vanessa exhaled slowly. But we already knew that. The officer nodded. Yes. But that's not the most important part. Richard was breathing heavily now. Because he already knew what came next. Officer Ruiz continued reading. This agreement also states that if either spouse engages in conduct that threatens the security of the property, including misrepresentation of ownership or attempts to leverage the property financially, that spouse forfeits residential claim. Vanessa frowned. Residential claim? The officer explained. It means they lose the right to live here. Vanessa slowly turned toward Richard. You said we were moving in here together. Richard didn't answer. Because the truth was standing in the middle of the room. Eleanor Whitmore owned the house. Eleanor Whitmore controlled who lived there. And Richard Whitmore had accidentally signed away his right to stay. Officer Ruiz folded the document neatly and placed it back on the table. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Ma'am, based on the deed and this agreement, you have the authority to request removal of anyone from this property." Anyone. The word echoed in the room. Richard looked desperate now. "Eleanor, this is insane." She didn't respond. Vanessa grabbed her suitcase from beside the sofa. "Wait," Richard said quickly. But Vanessa wasn't looking at him anymore. Her voice was cold now. "You told me this house was yours." Richard tried again. "I thought once the bank approved the refinance." "You don't even own it," she interrupted. No anger. Just disbelief. Then she shook her head. "I cannot believe I fell for this." Vanessa walked past him toward the door. The same woman who had laughed at Eleanor earlier. The same woman who called the police. And just like that, she was gone. The front door closed softly behind her. The house became quiet. Richard turned back toward Eleanor. "You planned this." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "I prepared for it." There's a difference. Planning revenge means chasing conflict. Preparation means protecting yourself before the conflict arrives. Officer Ruiz spoke again. "Sir, if the homeowner requests it, I'll need you to gather your belongings and leave the property." Richard stared at Eleanor. 28 years of marriage. And everything had come down to this moment. "You're really doing this?" he asked. Eleanor didn't raise her voice. Didn't show anger. She simply answered. "Yes." Officer Ruiz gestured toward the hallway. "You can pack a bag." Richard walked slowly down the hall. The same hallway Eleanor had decorated decades earlier. The same house he thought he could take. A few minutes later, he returned with a small suitcase. No dramatic goodbye. No final speech. Just quiet defeat. Officer Ruiz escorted him to the door. When it closed, the house became still again. Eleanor sat down on the sofa. The same sofa where Vanessa had been laughing earlier. For the first time all afternoon, she allowed herself a deep breath. The house looked exactly the same. The same walls. The same furniture. The same sunlight through the windows. But the illusion that had lived inside those walls for years was finally gone. And the strange part? All it took to reveal the truth was one folded piece of paper. Now imagine this. If you walked into your home tomorrow and someone tried to convince you it wasn't yours anymore, would you panic? Would you argue? Or would you calmly reach into your bag and hand them the one document that changes everything? Because sometimes the loudest moment in a betrayal is the silence that follows when the truth is finally read out loud.